do is we'll record up until the Q&A and conversation section. We'll stop at that point just to give everyone a chance to feel free to ask questions that they have and concerns or challenges or share things that you're involved with. And any links, resources that we mention during the presentation or later in the Q&A section, then we'll make sure those are emailed out to you afterwards. Right, let's get started. So let me just tell you a bit about what we're going to cover tonight. And then I'm going to hand over to Matt to just give a brief introduction to Just Money Movement and our Champions Network for those of you who are new to what we're doing. Then we'll take you through an introduction to campaigning for a greener, fairer banking sector. And this is part of a project that we're trying to bring together some introductory material and slides that you can hopefully use in your own churches and communities. Also, we'll run through that. Some of that for you might be quite introductory if you've been involved in campaigning and banks for a long time, but hopefully it'll be a refresher, but also give you maybe some top tips on how to start sharing with others and mobilizing others around these issues. So that will take about half an hour. We'll spend a bit of time thinking about how we build a movement for change and be hearing from you a bit about what would help you in terms of your engagement with banks. Some time for questions and answers around the material that we've shared. We'd love to hear from the kind of collective wisdom in the room about any topics for future training and resources. That's really important. And then share some next steps and dates for your diaries so that we can stay in touch beyond this evening. So that's what we're planning to cover this evening. I'm going to hand over to Matt just to kick us off with the brief introduction to the context for this training.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Rosie. Can I just check, have I been spotlighted? Or can we see the slides? There we go. I've got the slides up, I think. Brilliant. So as Rosie said, we're here with the Just Money movement. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, our vision is for a world where money shapes both a fairer and a greener future. We believe as Christians that our faith has much to say around the topic of money and how we steward our collective resources. And we are trying to build a movement across the UK church that is engaged on those issues of fairness, inequality, and poverty and also on climate justice through the lens of how we use our money and how we engage. So that looks like education and awareness raising for individuals to help them take action with their own money. But it also looks like campaigning and advocacy, both when it comes to government policy decisions that lawmakers have to make, but also around the financial sector as well. And my role as part of the Just Money movement is as one of our movement builders. That basically means that I get to run and convene and coordinate along with support from Rosie and my colleague George, our network of Just Money champions. Could we have the, actually, 1 second before the next slide. Great. Champions are our highly engaged and committed supporters who join in with our vision and want to give a little bit of time and energy and skill to helping make that vision a reality. And what happens for Just Money Champions? They become part of our network. We support you with relationships, communication, and training events like the one we're doing tonight. And we try and release and encourage and help coordinate action from our network, from our movement across the country in all sorts of different ways. And if we have the next slide, just some examples of some things that champions we have do. It's a whole range of things. It's a very widely defined role to meet your context and your skills. So it could be around sort of traditional speaking and leading and teaching on these themes. Some people are reaching out and engaging with local climate groups and other secular allies. Some of our champions spend lots of time emailing institutions that they support. Some of them are writers, some of them are distributors of our literature in all kinds of different places, and lots of them support us in our campaigns as well. If we have the next slide. So for those who become Just Money champions, this is basically what we offer to support you. So there's a monthly communication that comes from us as a central team, telling you all about the latest news and opportunities and things we'd like people to get involved with. We'll have regular one-to-one check-ins to get to know you a bit more, understand your context, figure out what sorts of things might be appropriate for you. And then we have a program through the year of training and of campaigns, which I'll come on to on the next slide. We're trying to build ways, not quite yet, sorry, trying to build ways for champions to connect with one another as well, where maybe they're geographically based similarly or maybe have shared interests on a particular subject. And we also would love this to be a two-way relationship as well. It's not just about us saying, can you get involved in our work? But we really want our champions to shape our own campaigning and our priorities, to give us ideas and suggestions, and for us to really learn and build together. Next slide, please. Just to give you a bit of a hint of what's coming up for Just Money Champions. The next training events we have planned through the year. So our next one in spring, which will be tied to a campaign of AGM shareholder engagement. We'll hear a little bit about that from Rosie in this session today, where we are going to be attending AGMs of some of the big banks and maybe some other companies as well, to hold them to account by using shares that Just Money owns and friends of ours have from investor groups and so on. And that's a really great way of having a direct challenge of accountability to boards of directors in companies that are harming people and planet. In the summer, we have Fair Tax Week. So we're talking about banking tonight, but Just Money also work quite a lot around the issue of tax. And that's a really high point in our year to be campaigning for a fairer tax system in the UK and globally. So I haven't got the exact date, that's a mistake. But keep your eyes peeled for opportunities for training and campaigning around Fair Tax Week in June. And similarly, we have Good Money Week in October, which is a chance to reflect more on the themes of how we can use money for good. Alongside this training, we also have organised campaigns that we get our champions involved with. And just to talk about them briefly, I've already mentioned the AGM campaigning, which will mostly be focused on banks and climate. And at the same time as that shareholder engagement advocacy, we're also running a campaign together with our friends at Just Love, which is a strategic targeted project where we're hoping to help a selection of 100 high wealth or high influence churches to get as much money as possible out of banks that are funding fossil fuels and into greener alternatives. So there's a really exciting kind of grassroots campaign that we're building there with people in those churches to train them and walk them through that process as well. Do I have another slide or is that me done, Rosie? Here we go. The last slide is, if you're at all interested, after tonight, I'll let you be the judge once we've finished the training session. If that sounds like something you've got a bit of time and energy and a vision that you want to sign up to, then please do. I encourage you to sign up at our website, justmoney.org.uk/champions. That's not a commitment at that point. It's a request to find out more. I'll be in touch with everyone who signs up there, and we can have a bit of a broader conversation about whether it's right for you or not. But yeah, if this is something that you feel excited by, energized, enthused by tonight, then I'd love for you to join us. And I'm going to hand back over to Rosie now to get into the meat of our session tonight. Really grateful for Rosie's expertise and time and wisdom that she's come to share with us today. Thanks, Rosie.
Thank you so much, Matt. Yes, really good to hear that refresher of the Champions Network, and it'd be great to have more people involved in it. It's been really encouraging to see how that network has grown since its launch over the last year or so. So I want to take you through, over the next 30 minutes, an introduction to campaigning for a greener, fairer banking sector. As I said at the beginning, this is the beginning of us trying to put together some introductory materials that we hope our Champions Network will be able to share locally, that other organisations and people involved in the movement will find useful as they engage other people in campaigning, as we try and build a stronger and bigger and more diverse movement, particularly amongst churches, as part of the way that we contribute to that wider movement that's campaigning for a greener, fairer banking sector. So this is very much a work in progress. We'd love to hear your feedback on the content of the training, and for you to think as you go along, if you were using these materials locally, what else would you want it to contain? What are the questions that you think you would be asked? What would you like to feel more equipped to talk about? So it'd be really, yeah, really helpful. I suppose there's a dual purpose for the training session this evening. It's to equip those of you who have come along and who are interested in these issues, but also to think through how we might share this more widely with our own churches and communities and what would help you to do that. So what I'm going to explore together, and it would really encourage you to use the chat to engage as we go. I may stop and ask a couple of questions and to hear your thoughts on things. But what we're going to cover is briefly the role that banks play in our economy. So just kind of digging into what's the point of banks, what are they doing, why should we be concerned about the way that banks behave? We'll look at the connection between banks and justice issues that we care about, like the climate crisis, poverty and inequality, racial justice. How do we make that link? Perhaps for others who we know are active and concerned around those issues, but haven't joined the dots yet to understanding how the banking sector relates to those issues. We'll touch on why, as Christians, we need to be concerned about how banks behave. We haven't got time to go into kind of lots of deep theological discussion this evening, but I've got some pointers for maybe starting that conversation from the perspective of Scripture, how we might begin to teach and preach on these issues. And then to move into a bit more of the practicalities as to what do we want to see the banking sector look like? What are the different levers for change? What are the different approaches and tactics, ways that we can try and shift things for the better? And yeah, again, as we go, if there are things that you're involved with, resources that you found helpful, please do add those into the chat. I really would like this to be a really collaborative evening of people sharing what's been useful for them, particularly if you're active in campaigning. So at that point, I'm going to ask Matt to share a quick poll, which we thought might be helpful for us to start with, which is just to get a sense of how active people are already in terms of campaigning for a fairer, greener banking sector. So just to invite you to respond to the poll, which is hopefully come up on your screen. And yeah, really helpful for us to get a sense of people's involvement already. That's fantastic. Thank you for doing that. I'll just give a moment for everyone to respond and then we'll move on to the next slide. So there we go. If the poll stays open on your screen and you need to close it to see the slides, then please do so. But that's really helpful. It looks like we've got a really good mix of people who would say they're very involved, but also plenty of people who are new to this area of campaigning. So I hope that this is helpful for all of you. So let's start with the basics. What do banks do? Banks have a really important role to play in the economy. So they look after the money that we deposit with them. I think that's what most people will understand what a bank does. Most people, that's their interaction with them. They help us pay for goods and services. So they enable us to pay for things, for example, with a debit card. And then importantly, in terms of what we're going to look at tonight, they lend money to individuals and businesses. Banks have significant power and influence, and they are a large part of the financial services industry in the UK, what we might also call the financial system or sector. They manage trillions of assets, estimated at around 14 trillion pounds. So that's just a snapshot of what banks do and their importance within the economy. But let's zoom in a little bit to that lending and investing, because that's really what we're interested in tonight in understanding a bit more about the impact of the lending and investing that banks do. So I'm sorry to jump straight into a bit more detail. Again, this might be really familiar to you, and I apologise if so, but I think helpful to just sometimes draw the distinction between different types of banking. So the banks, the way that we interact with them is mostly in terms of the retail banks, so the money that we deposit with those banks being used to make loans and investments. where from and there's a huge range in who and what banks lend to. So if we're looking at retail and commercial banks, they're lending to individuals and businesses, all the way through to investment banks, which lend to bigger businesses and multinational companies. And some banks will have both of those things going on, both retail and investment arms. And I think I've just pulled out this quote on the right-hand side of the slide, which I think is a really helpful reminder of the role that banks play in shaping our society and shaping the world around us because of this financing role that they have, because of these loans and investments. So the Global Alliance for Banking on Values is a network that brings together banks that are working for the common good, so particularly purpose-driven, value-based banks. And they say finance plays a pivotal role in shaping our society. Every loan and investment impacts our communities, environment, and economic future for better or worse. And if we think about the different types of lending and investing that banks do, they might be lending to a small business owner, or they might be lending millions of pounds in loans to big mining corporations or oil and gas companies. And I think it's important as well to note and to be reminded that banks create money. That's how they operate in terms of their the way that they lend out money and the high interest rates that they charge for borrowers. And in the way that they do that, they're creating new money that tends to flow into the property and financial markets rather than supporting the real economy. So that's something I guess to highlight in our conversations is that to try and understand a bit more about how banks operate, where those financial flows are going. Certainly some of those bigger banks, their focus is much more on those more speculative markets, making money out of money, rather than going into the real economy, which is supporting the things that we all need to live and to thrive. So the money that we deposit with a bank enables it to do its business. The bank decides what it will finance, and the decisions that those banks make shape the world around us now and in the future. So why should we be concerned about how banks behave? I was thinking about how to best kind of show this and show the kind of variety of ethical issues that we might be concerned with. And I just went back and looked at some of the headlines that I've noted about banks' behaviour over the last few years. And you can see here the range of different issues that we might want to pay close attention to, whether that's financing of fossil fuels, whether that's banks' role in tax avoidance, other polluting sectors that banks are financing and lending to, greenwashing, a big concern at the moment. And then again, maybe some of the things that don't often meet the headlines, and maybe some of us haven't been as much engaged in, is the relationship between banks and poor and marginalised communities. So bank branch closures. I mean, these might be conversations that you are having locally about the impact on the retreat of the banking sector from poorer communities, or the way in which banks maybe discriminate between different sections of the community in terms of access to services. And I can share this slide as a way of maybe helping you think about, well, what might be your way into talking about the banking sector and its impacts. And it might be that it's relating it to some of the issues that you're working on locally, or that are of concern to your church community. The things that are impacting on the communities that you are in touch with. Sometimes it helps to make that connection between the kind of things that you're working on in other ways, and then draw these links, help people understand more about how the banking sector impacts on those issues. And another place that you might start is actually from faith and from scripture. And as I said, we don't really have time to do this justice, but I just wanted to pull out a few threads that might help us in engaging more people with ethical finance from a faith perspective. And as Christians, we don't have a blueprint for how banks should behave, or how we should engage with our banks, how we should campaign for change. But we can find principles in scripture that guide us in our thinking and behaviour with money, and how to respond when we see injustice. So just a few thoughts here. Firstly, all of our money is ultimately God's, like everything else. Psalm 24 tells us the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. The very first command or instruction that God gives to humanity in the Genesis account is to work and take care of the garden. That is to create value from what God has given us in creation, but to do so in a way that looks after and does not destroy it. As we look through scripture, we find a vision of God's economy that's rooted in abundance, where all are provided for. We find warnings not to hoard that abundance, but to trust in God and share with our neighbours. We find systems of restoration like the Jubilee to return resources to those without and to bring justice to the poor and marginalised. And we're urged to speak up when we see injustice. Jesus spoke frequently about money, challenging the wealthy and lifting up the poor and excluded, and calling us to live sacrificial and generous lives. And we can look to the example of the early Christian communities in Acts, who modelled for us a neighbourly economy where resources were shared with all who were in need. So I think by just introducing some of those threads that run through scripture, we can begin to see that acting justly with money, whether that's as individuals or collectively, is part of how we live out our faith. It's part of how we witness to God's kingdom. And in drawing that link then between our faith and the banking sector, our banks connect us to our neighbours locally and globally, and then therefore to the whole of God's creation. It follows, therefore, and I would argue strongly that we should then take an interest in how our banks steward the money that we deposit with them. We give a degree of power over to the banks in terms of the stewardship of our own finances. And so we should care about the kind of world that our banks are shaping. So I hope that gives you maybe a few points into having those conversations locally. Please do feel free to share in the chat as we go along ways that you've started the conversation, if you have, in your churches or with communities that you're engaged with. It'd be really helpful to see where you find that common ground, where you find possibilities for opening up conversations about ethical banking, about greener banking. And I wanted to now just zoom in a couple of issues. So I'm going to look first at banking and the climate crisis, and then we're going to look at banking and racial justice as just two examples, again, of ways that you might start to talk about the banking sector, connecting it to issues that you're concerned about. And I think for many of us, the way that banks and the climate crisis are linked is often our way into campaigning on banking related issues, because I think that awareness has grown, I think particularly amongst Christian organisations and campaigners, that I've noticed over the last few years a much deeper understanding of the links between banks and finance and the climate crisis as part of that wider movement across society, which is becoming more aware of those links. And a really helpful resource for this in terms of understanding the scale of financing that is fueling the climate crisis that's coming from our banks and going into the oil and gas companies, the Banking on Climate Chaos report, which comes out every year. It has a really interactive website behind it as well. So if you want to dig into a bit more detail about individual banks, if you want to understand a bit more about the impact of those investments and financing, it also has case studies, looks to places in the global south where projects are, in terms of fossil fuel financing, are happening, and the impact that has on communities. So if this is something you want to know more about, I would really recommend the Banking on Climate Chaos materials. There'll be another one coming out this spring to just understand a bit more about the links between banks and the climate crisis. And I've just picked out some of the stats here for you to understand a bit more about the relationship between the UK big banks and fossil fuel financing. It's worth pointing out that obviously the scale of the financing does vary. That's mostly to do with the size and scale of the banks themselves and their global operations. I'm conscious in sharing this that it may look like Lloyds is doing a great job in comparison to some of the bigger banks, but that's not necessarily reflected in its policies. And I can share in some resources later some really good resources out there that track the policies of those big five banks and the progress or not progress that they're making in terms of exclusions that they're bringing in and ways in which they are meeting or not meeting their net zero targets. So that's a snapshot, but if you want to know a bit more about individual banks, we can point you towards information around that. But clearly, if banks are continuing to finance fossil fuel industry without really paying attention to the transition that's needed, and without reinvesting money that should be moving away from the fossil fuel industry into cleaner technology and climate solutions. We're looking at a really difficult scenario over the next few years. What we really need is a greener banking sector that protects nature, that's tackling a climate crisis, that's shifting finance into climate solutions. And at the moment, through our big banks, we don't have that. And some of you might have noticed headlines in the last couple of weeks of more and more banks moving away from the Net Zero Banking Alliance, watering down their net zero commitment. So it's really timely, really urgent cause, and something that we need to pay close attention to. Moving on to another way to think about how we campaign for a fairer and greener banking sector. A couple of years ago, Positive Money, who campaigned for better regulation of the finance sector, wrote a really powerful series of blogs highlighting the links between banking, race, and colonialism. And I think if, like me, you've come to bank campaigning through your climate action, this might not be something that you've engaged with very much, but the roots of climate and racial injustice are interlinked. There's inequality and injustice built into the system. If we look back historically at the role that banks and central banks played in slavery, the way they benefited from the slave trade. We look at the way that banks treated the Windrush generation as people arrived here in the UK to build their lives, not giving them access to services and excluding them, the racism that people found when they tried to access financial services. We can kind of track a history of racial injustice in the banking sector over many, many years. And you may not be aware that there's some really important research that Fair for All Finance did a couple of years ago, where they spoke to and interviewed many, many people from minority ethnic groups about their experience of the finance sector and their experience of banking, and found multiple examples of discrimination and barriers in accessing financial services. So people might not be able to access what they need. They might have difficulty in accessing affordable credit, which then means people borrow from payday lenders and illegal loan sharks. So there's plenty there, again, for us to engage with and to speak out where we see injustice. We really need a fairer banking sector that ensures everyone has access to the financial services they need to live fully. So yeah, I can share more resources around this if this angle of banking campaigning is something that you're interested in learning more about. So there's some really good people working in this area. And I should have said that earlier, another colleague of ours who wasn't able to join us today, George Amadi, is doing a particular piece of work engaging with Black majority churches and Black Christian leaders. This is one of the things that he hears a lot from churches and church communities, is still around access to banking and access to services. So we're supporting him in that work and trying to get some of those voices heard by the banking sector. So again, if that's something that if you're involved in churches that would like to start campaigning on this area of work, then be glad to connect you with George so you can hear a bit more about the work that he's doing. But that's a bit about why we need to be concerned around the way that banks are behaving. But I think it's really important to note that it doesn't have to be this way. There are plenty of banks that put people and planet first, that are investing in the green transition, that are tackling financial exclusion, that are working for and supporting charities and social enterprises and that sector. And again, that are addressing regional inequalities, that are lending to small and medium enterprises across the country. And I include within that building societies and credit unions too. I've been using banking really as kind of shorthand for the banking sector as a whole. But there are lots and lots of purpose-led, values-based banks, mutual-led banks and the building societies who have a structure of being member-led, not shareholder and not publicly listed like some of the big banks. We also have credit unions which serve their members and invest back into their communities. So yeah, you may know of examples near you, lots of really good examples of banks that are leading the way in the sector and showing that there is a different way of doing banking. And I think that's really important for us to be able to talk to others about, is to share is to share the good news and to share what's happening across the sector, where people may just mainly be familiar with the big high street banks. Really important to draw attention to the good work that's going on too. I think that's a myth that we often have to overcome, is that all banks are the same, when that's just not true. There are plenty of banks that are doing things differently. There are banks that put people and planet at the heart of their business model. Um, and I can say a bit more about that later in where you might find out more information about those banks. But I think it's also then helpful to understand that the ethical banking sector is small in the UK. We're quite unusual in that our kind of mutual and cooperative banking sector in the UK is quite small. There are other countries where that's not the case. We have this dominance of the big five banks. And I'm trying to sort of find ways of visually representing that. So I've looked here at total assets of the big five banks in the UK versus ethical banks and building societies, when it makes it very, very difficult to actually show because of the scale. So the largest green that you can see, which refers to the biggest, the ethical banking sector, is Nationwide Building Society. The next smallest one, which is just down above NatWest, is the Co-op Bank, and then the much smaller ones are those that are really serving the charity sector. Other people like Unity Trust and CAF Bank, and you can see how much they are dwarfed in scale by the big five banks. So I thought that was helpful just for those of us who are campaigning around this and looking at what we can do. Really useful to just understand a bit more about the scale of those different banks. And here's another way of looking at it in terms of retail customers in the UK. Lloyds, Barclays, NatWest dominating the market still, but Nationwide is up there. Nationwide as a building society, really well known and trusted by people. But as you move down, you see again smaller and smaller numbers with some of the more ethical banks, and maybe some of the capacity of some of those banks will take longer to grow. Some of you will have been maybe banked with Triodos, and will have known that their business banking closed a couple of years ago because they didn't quite have the capacity to meet the need and the scale of people who are wanting to move to them. We're hopeful that that will reopen soon, but I think there is some sense of us needing to grow that ethical green banking sector, and make sure that they have the capacity to take on board new customers. And we'll come on to a little bit of that when we talk about switching in a moment. So I hope that's just a helpful way for you to visualise what the banking sector looks like in the UK, and maybe to share some of that with those you're talking with, about why there's that need for action and why we need to champion the ethical banking sector more. But while we're doing that, and while we're wanting to champion and switch money away from the big five banks, the wider banking sector is still involved in financing many, many things that are harmful. And that's why we can't afford to not pay close attention. We need to be paying really close attention to what those big banks are doing. The money, where that money is going, the kind of financing that's happening, and their lack of action around financial exclusion and inclusion. So lots of things for us to certainly to be concerned about and to pay attention to. And I want to just say a little bit more about how we can then engage for change and what that might look like. So again, I've tried to visually represent the different ways in which we can campaign for a fairer, greener banking sector, what that looks like. And so I tried to split it into a couple of different approaches. So on the left-hand side, we have those of us who are involved in trying to transform the system, and those of us engaged in trying to champion alternatives. And often we're doing both, and campaigns will focus on both of those things. But I think that's helpful. Two ways of looking at it. Transforming the system is about how we are trying to shift the dominance and the practices of those big five banks. And champion alternatives is about how we try and support then the greener ethical banking sector. So there are lots of, I call them levers for change or tools for change, that we can use to influence how those big banks behave. Consumer pressure is still really important, I think, in terms of banks' reputation. Consumer-led campaigning and also the way in which we engage if we are customers with those banks, I think still has an impact. Investor engagement, shareholder action, Matt mentioned earlier, is something that we engage with at Just Money Movement, is through institutions that have shares or have investments, is using that investor power and that investor voice to hold banks to account, to scrutinise the work that they're doing, to ask questions at their AGMs. And sometimes that's as much about the story and the media that surrounds it as it is about the answer that you receive back. But those investor coalitions can be really powerful as well. And we've seen an increase in that kind of action against the banks in recent years. Faith-based and civil society campaigns, I guess just a broad umbrella there. It might involve things like boycotts. It might involve the kind of education work that we're trying to do, helping people understand more about the behaviour of those banks, links in with consumer pressure, but it's about building from the bottom up that movement of people who are concerned about how those big banks are behaving. Regulatory change, I think, is going to be increasingly important. If banks are not moving swiftly enough, certainly in terms of the climate crisis, then regulatory change and then being forced to change their policies might be the only way in which we get them to where we need to be. And so we'll be looking out for opportunities this year with allies who work more on policy and advocacy to look at where are those opportunities for regulatory change, where is there parliamentary engagement that should be happening to draw more attention to these issues. One of the opportunities that might come up this year, there was a commitment in the Labour manifesto around mandatory transition plans for big companies, including banks. We haven't seen much movement on that, and that there is likely to be a consultation on it later this year. That would put much more pressure on the banks to align their financing with the Paris Agreement. So there may be opportunities coming up where we can use that kind of lever, and there may be some popular campaigning we can do around that, where we can encourage people to speak to their MP and get that interest building through government as well. And then another angle is legal action. So some of you might be aware of the work people like Client Earth, who would bring lawsuits against companies. They've done that around greenwashing in the past. I think increasingly there might be opportunities to bring legal action against banks. I've seen some movement on that in Europe. There's interest amongst the World Council of Churches and in this approach as well. So we're kind of paying close attention to that. It might be that there are opportunities to get engaged in that type of campaigning as well. And then to accompany that, there is that real need to champion alternatives, and many of us have been engaged in that through switching campaigns, through education, trying to get more people to move away, to switch away from the big high street banks into more ethical banks, to move more investments into climate solutions. And I think that plays a really important part as well. Sends a message to the wider banking sector that this is what people want and need. But it's I think something that many of us come into this campaigning through that route, through looking at our own personal finances or our church finances, and then might get a bit more engaged in some of the more system change work, but still really important. And that movement is growing, and seen over the last couple of years, many more banks, many more churches having conversations about where they bank, particularly motivated by their work maybe for Eco Church Awards. And it's been really encouraging to see how the Eco Church survey has, in its revision recently, has got much more in there about finance, has got some really detailed stuff in there about how we use our banking and investing as churches. So I'm hopeful that movement will just continue to build. Thanks, Matt, for keeping an eye on the chat as we go along. That's great. I'm seeing messages pop up, but we'll make sure we come to any unanswered questions when we come to Q&A in a moment. So what can you do, and what can those that are in your churches and communities that you're in touch with, what can you do? So some really simple actions. So certainly for individuals, we'd encourage people to join the Big Bank Switch, which is an encouragement to pledge and then to move to a greener bank. We'll pop some links in the chat that you can follow to find out more about the Big Bank Switch. Yeah, that moving of money is still really important. But alongside that is that being able to tell the story publicly about why that's happening. And we have a target of 1,000 Christians moving to greener banks this year. So if you're already with a bank, or if you switch, if you're already with a greener bank or you've switched recently, we'd love to hear your motivation for switching. If we can tell your story, I think that will be help us engage others and build that movement. You can review your church's banking. Every year we produce a greener, fairer banking guide, not just looking at climate issues, but other issues too. And we compare 4 of the more ethical banks that provide current accounts that are suitable for churches. So yeah, I would encourage you, if you haven't started a conversation about your church's banking, to use that banking guide to begin that work. Obviously, that is a more time-consuming thing than switching as an individual. But if you can then increase the impact of that switch and by telling the story of what you're doing. I think often if a church is switching its own banking, it encourages its members to think about their banking too. There are lots of ways in which you can kind of increase the impact of your switch by talking about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And then an encouragement to join in with that more system change work, to campaign with us for a fairer, greener banking sector. We hope to have campaign actions you can join in with this year, and I'll say a bit more about those in a moment. But an encouragement to do what you can and to encourage others, as I know that many of you are already doing. So that's the series of slides that kind of take us through an introduction to greener, fairer banking campaigning. Conscious that there may be many more questions that you have that are not answered in that kind of really introductory way into thinking about banking campaigning. But would be great as we get into a bit more of a Q&A and conversation to hear about what would be helpful for you in starting those conversations locally or getting more engaged with campaigning. What else would you want to know, and what else do you want to be equipped to speak to others about? But before we get on to that kind of time for Q&A, I just wanted to say something briefly about our priorities at Just Money Movement for our banking work, just so you can get a sense of like the kinds of things that you might be able to get involved with in the coming year. So what we'll be doing this year, we'll continue to try and resource individuals and churches to learn and take action. So that's like developing resources like these slides that we've put together this evening. We'd like to produce a short video or animation that you can use in talks and services. We'll be again trying to add more information and resources to our website. The Money Makes Change Hub has a page on banking, but we'd like to look at that and see if there's more that we can include there. And we'll be reviewing our banking guide for churches in the autumn. And we're always looking for people to provide feedback on resources or to test things out, to write for resources. So if that's something that interests you, energizes you, then it'd be great to have your involvement. At the end of last year and for the rest of this year, we're going to be delivering some greener finance training to church treasurers. This started with the URC with a small grant from them to begin that work. And then we're hoping to roll that out to other denominations. So we had 40 church treasurers on a call yesterday evening, going into some of the details around switching to greener banks, also looking at greener purchasing, greener investing. So if that's something that would be useful for you in any networks that you belong to, then do get in touch, because we'd be happy to come and run that training. We, as Matt said earlier, will be supporting individuals and organisations and churches to get involved in AGM activism during the AGM season, particularly I think HSBC and Barclays will be targets this year. But we want to resource you to campaign on the issues that matter to you. So if there are banks and companies that you would like to have that direct conversation with, then come along to our AGM activism training, and we can hopefully link you up with people who have shares to lend and support you to go and ask those questions, or to get involved in some of the wider coalition work that's happening there. And we'll also continue this year to try and convene churches and charities in that more strategic engagement with the banking sector. So conversations and engagement with big five banks, but also conversations with the ethical banking sector as well. They're advocating for the needs of churches and charities and talking to the ethical banks about any barriers to switching services that churches and maybe bigger organisations and institutions need. So if that's something that interests you, then we'd be glad again to have your involvement in that. And just something to leave you with as a reflection, maybe to think about the part that you might play in that movement. Our approach is there in our name, that we want to build a bigger and more diverse movement, and we want to do that certainly in the banking campaigning that we're engaged with. But we're really conscious of being part of a much wider movement across civil society that's engaging in lots of different ways to try and shift the banking sector for the better. And I think really helpful to reflect on the role that we each play as individual campaigners and as organisations, because there's a breadth of different approaches across the movement. And yeah, something to maybe go away and think about: where's your place? Where is your calling? Discern where you fit within that movement. Are we helpers? Are we advocates? Are we organisers? Are we rebels? So helpers might be those who are trying to meet direct needs. So, maybe financial inclusion is really important to you, and actually, yeah, that's what you want to do. Advocates are those that are trying to change the system from within. So maybe you're really interested in really scrutinising what banks are doing, keeping on top of that. You're really interested in policy work. If you're an organizer, then you're probably someone that's wanting to mobilize others, wants to be involved in education and training. If you're a rebel, then maybe direct action and civil disobedience is your approach. And I think we need all of those people within the movement. There's been lots of studies that say that successful movements have all of these different types of people within them. So that might be helpful for you to go away and think about what's the role that you might play. And another way of thinking about it is to think about movements as an ecology of different approaches. As this comes from Neon, who are a network really involved in movement building in the UK around economic justice. And similarly, they divide it up into these three different categories: personal empowerments, which might be around educating people around their financial choices, educating people about the banking sector; building alternatives, so getting involved in championing those alternatives, those greener, ethical parts of the banking sector; or challenging the dominant institutions. Maybe that's the thing that really attracts you, and you want to see that system change. So hopefully in the midst of that, there are things that you see that, yes, that's what I want to get involved with. And if we can resource you to do that, and to connect you up with others, then that's what we really hope to do through the Champions Network, is to make sure that you don't feel alone in any campaigning that you're doing, that you feel connected to others and you can share what you're doing.